Okay, so we're going to get started now. I'm going to assume right now that you folks are all able to hear me okay. And if anybody has any questions at any point, please feel free to put that question out. Or if anyone is having any difficulties hearing, let us know. I'm Eric Owen. I'm the creator of Understanding. I've been in education for, I don't know, 20 some odd years or more. I'll skip the bio information. Some of that's on the website. And talk directly about what it is that we're here to talk about today. The purpose of today is to focus on how we can best teach. This is going to be targeted at anybody who is teaching, whether you are a parent, a teacher, or anywhere else. At a previous webinar, we did a real quick survey of different educational approaches, and during this one, I wanted to get much more specific. And in fact, my hope is that in today's webinar that we can even make this a little bit interactive. I know that is sometimes difficult with webinars, but if you could, I think in the notes about the webinar we had asked even if you could come prepared with questions or with an idea of specific things that you wanted to make sure that we accomplished, that would be a good thing. So as I go through this, what I'm going to do is pause at times, and if you have a question, if there's a design question that you have, what we'll try to do is we'll try to answer this question live and in person. Now, rather than start with some boring old slide here, I think it's worth noting what the real purpose is of education, why we're here. Sadly, education has taken a long journey from what it should be, which is a joyous experience, an opportunity to really experience, participate, and enjoy the world around you. Good education is all about deep learning, and deep learning is an experience that too often is lost. We lose that joy. We lose those really wonderful opportunities to celebrate in the learning that we're doing. I want to just find out real quickly from you folks, if you can just respond to the poll that's up there. I'm going to just spend just a few moments. I'm just wondering if anyone here has ever attended a webinar with us before. And it looks like we have about a 2/3, 1/3 mix. So if you've returned, thank you for returning. I am going to cover some of the things that we've touched on previously. So hopefully that will work well for you folks, mostly be getting into a lot more information. The next thing I'd like to know is if you can help me with this one. I'd love to know who's here participating. If you could just let me know real quick, just so I can try to skew what we're doing here a little bit, that would also be very helpful. And I'm curious here, it looks like we have a good percentage of people who are other. So if you don't mind, if you get a chance, if you can just type at me, type in the chat box. I'm curious to know what your background is or what your interests are. Perhaps, for example, maybe you're from corporate America. If you could just let me know that, that would be terrific. I'd be curious to know. All right, so let's get started. Those, if you were here previously, you may know who this is. This is our good friend, B.F. Skinner. Take yourself back to college psychology and see if you can remember what this man's big discovery was. And as you think about that, I'll give you a little bit of context. And I'm going to go through this really quickly because we covered this at a previous webinar. Long story short, coming out of the Industrial Revolution, we needed a way to make education much more efficient. We needed a factory model for education that would support the factory model in use in what was growing into corporate America. A lot of the work of this man, B.F. Skinner, was adapted to the world of education, and it sits at the root, for sure, of modern education. And I want to make sure we speak through how those techniques should be applied to education today. I'm going to present 3 different techniques, and just to anticipate a question, there is no answer to the question of which one is best. The first method I'm going to present on is called behaviorism, and it is the form most familiar to people in school today? Behaviorism is all about stimulus response. Stimulus response. What B.F. Skinner learned is that he could provide a stimulus to a pigeon and then gain a response. Last time I think we talked about Pavlov's dogs. The same is true for pigeons, where you can teach them to peck at a button in order to get fed. The key here is small stimulus leading to a response and then providing direct and immediate response to that stimulus. So here we have an amusing cartoon from our good friend Gary Larson. Don't you ever think? Well, you know what? Part of what behaviorism believes is that anyone can be taught to learn anything. That really, it was more about what the teacher does than what it is that the student does. So that if the learner does as the instructor tells him, then he or she is going to be able to learn whatever it is he or she needs to learn. It's all about the feedback loop between stimulus and response. Okay, so the whole challenge here is to break down what needs to be learned into the smallest steps possible. And I'm going to go through a specific example on how we can do that shortly. This is what we're looking at right now is the proper process for learning the behavioristic approach and how to apply it. When I say proper, it's actually mostly proper. I've adapted, I've simplified it a little bit. So if any of you have degrees in instructional design, you'll forgive me. I have indeed left out a few steps for the purpose of simplicity. But let me talk you through it. And what I want to do is even use some examples that you guys might have. So if there's something that you're trying to teach, I want to come back to this and try to apply that after I've gone through the next few slides. The first step here, the first thing you got to do is get the attention of the audience that you're working with. Step two, and we're going to talk about this in all the approaches that we use. This is going to be important always, is that what you want to do is make it clear to people what it is that they need to learn. State the objective, define the purpose. Now, at this point, as long as the teacher makes the objective statement clear, that's all we need to do. Then you provide a stimulus, you solicit a response, and you provide feedback on that response. Now that cycle, stimulus, response, feedback, that keeps circling until the person has learned what they need to respond, until they have learned what they need to learn. And at the end, it is very important that you reward, or certainly B.F. Skinner would allow it in behaviorism, or punish people who have failed to accomplish the objective that you have stated. Okay? How does that do for you? Does that make sense? If you have any questions before I go on, let me know. We are going to break this down and work through some examples with this. I'll just pause and make sure there's no questions. Okay. Now what we want to talk about is, before you start teaching them, what is it that you need to do? That process is called task analysis. I'm going to jump forward a section just so you know what a task analysis would look like. Essentially what you're doing is you're creating a hierarchy of the subject that you want to teach. In this case, let's say what I want to teach today is how to teach. So the first thing that I would want to do at the highest level is that I want to impress upon you that there are different learning styles. Then what I'm going to do is create a hierarchy. And coming down that hierarchy, I'm going to break the subject matter into smaller and smaller subjects. So as you see here, I'm going to come down to behaviorism and ultimately to stimulus and response. And what I'm going to determine is that the stimulus and response nugget is the smallest nugget that I need to break this into for the audience that I'm speaking to. Okay? Now recognize I'm skipping a big part of the instructional design process, which is called audience analysis. Just know, obviously, before you create instruction, you have to be acutely aware of who the audience is. So following the steps, the first thing we should do understand the audience, understand their strengths and weaknesses, who they are, what prerequisite knowledge they might be required to know. Then you do the task analysis. And I can show you detailed examples of a task analysis if that's useful to people. And then once you have the task analysis, what you do, if you can see my mouse, is you start at the lowest level. You teach that. Once you are confirmed that the subject has been learned, you would then go to the next level. And then you would go to everything else at that layer. And once that has been learned, and only at that point, you then advance to the next higher level. It is reasonable that you would perform a formal assessment at each level of the task analysis. It sort of guides you. But good instruction in the behavioristic model, and by the way, I might ultimately argue any really good instruction, requires a teacher to do this detailed task analysis. Again, if you have questions on that, or if it's not familiar to you and you want more information, please let me know. And I do notice that we've got a couple people here from outside of education, from outside K-12 anyway. This absolutely applies in corporate America. I've done a lot of corporate America consulting and training, and when you hire instructional designers, this is absolutely one of the first things that they start with. Also, and I do notice also that we have somebody here who works with students who are struggling in school. The major difference here, just to address this to you as well, is that if you're doing this with an audience where kids or adults are struggling to learn, the whole key here is the size of the nugget that you create and then the speed at which you're cycling through stimulus and response. And if you have questions about that, again, just fire them away to me. Okay, I'm actually going to back up for a moment. Oops, that's forward. Okay, so now just back to task analysis. Let's just talk about how you'd conduct a task analysis. Let's say that this is your responsibility, or let's say you're not the one doing it, but you're overseeing somebody who's doing this. You want to make sure that they're doing this properly. In all likelihood, you need at least 2 different people involved in a task analysis. You need an expert, and you need the person who is going to speak to the expert and assure that the expert has broken down the problem sufficiently. The challenge here is you can't depend on the expert to conduct the task analysis. Marshall McLuhan said, "I know not who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish." That's directly applicable here. The point is, when you conduct a task analysis, if you are too familiar with the subject, it's going to be hard to understand what the learner needs, and it's going to therefore be hard to break that subject into the smallest and most usable nuggets. Okay? Any questions on that? Again, just shout them out. What I'd like to do is try to make this a little bit practical. I'd like to take a look at an example, and I can either use an example that I've got, or if anyone wants to just type at me quickly something they're trying to teach, I can try to respond to that, and we can try to make that the example if possible. So I'll just give you a couple moments in case you want to do that, and if no one sends me anything, I'll just go to my own list. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, let's look at this as an example. Oops. Okay. This may be a little hard to see, but I wanted you at least to have a pretty good understanding. I think it's useful to be able to see one of these, so at least I thought I would show you one, and then I'm going to create a document, and we'll real quickly show you how this would work. So what we're looking at here is what's called a content analysis. Let's say I wanted to teach you color theory. Okay. This is how this subject has been broken down. Notice anything with a higher number is a more complicated skill. And as we scan down, and I know there's a lot here. As we go through each subject, so for example, if we look at how the eye sees color, we can start at this level 6, which are the highest level skills. This is actually based upon something called Bloom's taxonomy, which I'm not going to get into today, but it's a useful way to categorize information. And because how the eye sees color is a very important subject related to color, we can see all the different level skills right down to knowledge base. Knowledge base equals fact that we would need to learn for this subject. This comprises the task analysis, and I could very easily break this entire document into some sort of chart that makes it all clear. Let's say we were teaching about baseball. Can you, by the way, see the screen that I'm typing on? I'm assuming you can. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So let's say we wanted to learn about baseball. I'm just making it up right now, making it up and winging it as we go. Okay, so first I'm going to just this is exactly how I would do it in the real world. I would just start brainstorming. In all likelihood, I'd be interviewing an expert, getting feedback from him. Then I would come up to here, critical rules. Okay, so I would just continue building the outline out in that fashion. And in all likelihood, just to give you some sense for how long that this should take, use this as a rule of thumb. Okay, I should actually have a slide for this. 1 hour of instruction will take you 8 hours to put together, right? Of that 8 hours that it's going to take you to put together, you should figure at least 20% is upfront design. So you can figure you're going to spend at least an hour to hour and a half on this part of content outlining and working with an expert. And I would say minimum hour to hour and a half. But just as I began to do right here, that is the process of task analysis. Okay. Now let's say that I wanted to teach you about balls and strikes. And I wanted to teach you that using the behavioristic process. Okay. Let's go back to the process outlined here. And using that example, let's just talk through it. The first thing I'd have to do is get gain your attention somehow. I picked a subject that's for some probably going to be easy, but let's think of I might say to you, look, baseball starts tomorrow. We're all excited for it. We're going to be doing that in gym, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity to, no one wants, here's the way I could do it, is, we all want to do well in the game. No one wants to strike out, so therefore I bet it's really good for you to pay attention to me right now. By the way, that's a really bad way to get attention because I'm using a negative, but it's certainly a way. Another way to do it is to say, look, we're going to a game tomorrow. If you guys want to be able to really get the most value out of it, let's pay attention. Then I make my objective clear. My objective by the end of this class is to make sure you're able to play an entire game of baseball and understand the rules and not have to need any guidance from the umpire during the course of the entire game. Now, I might even then say, hey, class, how does that sound to you? Then I would begin to provide the stimulus. So I'd go to the most basic level. I'd say, let's start with balls. A ball is a pitch you don't have to strike out. The strike zone is between your knees and your shoulders. Stop. Maybe I'd bring a child up, and I'd say, here's the strike zone. The stimulus I would provide is I would touch his shoulder, I would touch his knee and say, that's the strike zone. Now I would solicit a response. Hey, Ellen, stand up. Show me where the strike zone is. Class, is that the strike zone? Yes, great. Done. And then I would say, great job. Looks like you've all learned the strike zone. Now let's go on to the next subject. Okay. Does that make sense? That is the behavioristic approach applied in its purest form. Now just compare and contrast this to schools today. Often, not that I want to be overly critical, but often, well, let's say almost always the behaviorist approach is what's used in school. The concern I have is it's not often used well. Often a concern I have is there's not enough focus on what the right size is for the stimulus, and there's not enough interaction between the stimulus and the response. We go too far, too much talk. Behavioristic approach assumes that the teacher is in charge of the learning, absolutely. It does not assume that the class needs to be quiet. We'll look at this later. The learners are passive. They're not in charge of the learning, but they are not necessarily quiet. Okay? Does that make sense? What I'm going to do now is proceed to the next subject. I want to give you a different approach. So if there's any questions that you want to make sure get clarified before I go on, start typing them out me. So, bonus points. I think that who are the most quoted people of all time, scholarly? The scholars most referred to in scholarly literature. It used to be that, I think, oh God, Einstein or I think maybe Einstein and Freud were 1 and 2. And this guy is number 3. So we're talking world-class researcher. Anyone know who he is? Bonus points if you do. If you know who he is, type it at me. I'll give you a moment if I don't have anyone here stumped. This is the man that sort of broke the back of behaviorism. And I had mentioned this last time, and it's worth mentioning again. Again, remember, behaviorists. They assume anyone can be taught anything. This man blew that apart. It's really kind of interesting. What he did is he proved in an extraordinarily complicated way, not Deming, although Deming, one of my favorite scientists of all time, I'll even try to throw a Deming quote at you later. This man blew apart the theory of behaviorism. What he proved in an extraordinarily complicated manner is that there is one thing that cannot be taught: language. Language is an innate ability. He proved with linguistical technique that we are born to learn a language. In doing so, he proved he blew apart the assumption that behaviorism can work in any approach. And as soon as you demonstrate it doesn't work in one approach, it falls apart. This launched the cognitive sciences revolution. This man's name is Noam Chomsky, C-H-O-M-S-K-Y. You can certainly Google him. He's a brilliant, certainly controversial gentleman, but has had enormous impact in thinking about thinking from the world of cognitive science. Now, what the cognitive scientists believe in, to them, it's all about Legos. It's what we are doing is constructing knowledge. So what we're doing is putting together ways to go about learning, and we're going about ways to construct knowledge ourselves. So it's sort of like the Lego metaphor that we're using there. Take a look right now at this for a moment and just think about this. Spend 5 or 10 seconds looking at it. Okay, so I'm going to go in a complete diversion now. This is called the Seth Johnson House. This is a building. Take a look at it. What do you think of it? Pretty nice looking? Here's the outside. How's that house look? And here's the shot from the interior. Pretty nice looking, right? And then how many of you, I should have a poll for this, how many of you would like to live in this house? Does it look like a pretty amazing place to live? And I promise you I'm going to make some sense out of this for you in a moment to tell you why I'm talking about this. Another picture from inside the house. Again, how's that look to you? Would you like to live here? Now let's talk about what the visitor's reaction is to this house. Read this quote. "The floor is hard on the feet." This is, I should have mentioned, this is a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Frank thought that plywood was a really good material for furniture, and guess what? It's not. The bedroom has low ceilings. It's stuffy and claustrophobic. We're told that the roof leaks. There's no privacy whatsoever, not a curtain in the place. If you're on the toilet when someone drives up, you can wave to them. And there's no way to put a log in the fireplace without banging your head. Okay, this is one of those that if, I wish we weren't webinaring here because I would love to have a conversation about this. The question I'd ask you is, what's the point of this? Why am I telling you this? Frank Lloyd Wright's process of design, to me, is very, very much rooted in behaviorism. And to me, it's a really good metaphor in that it speaks to some of the strengths and it speaks to some of the weaknesses. In this case, Frank Lloyd Wright is demonstrating, I mean, he is the all-American hero. He's the man in charge. He's the person up in front. He has command. We know we need to pay attention to him. I mean, they wrote a book about this guy, right, called The Fountainhead. And Frank Lloyd Wright is famous for knowing more than the resident, right? Falling Water, you know, it's the famous story about a man called Frank because it was leaking on his desk, and his response was move the desk. You know, the architect knows more. That is the behavioristic approach. What is the point here of what I'm telling you? This approach that Chomsky discovered brought us to a very different approach to learning. Okay, he's showing us a process that's all about usability. This is a process called user-centered. Okay, the process of designing instruction is much different because under this scenario, notice in the previous system, I never really said test, understand the response, understand how the students are reacting to the material you're providing. We assume if you do a good job, the students will learn. Through cognitive science, it is completely different. This is a much more user-centered approach. It's all about usability. As an aside, there is a terrific book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn, which demonstrates architecture as an excellent model for the split, the dichotomy between behaviorism and the cognitive science revolution. Again, not judging which one's better, just saying that what the material will do is demonstrate to you how that split occurs. So let's stay on this one more moment. So again, notice an enormous difference right now is that under the cognitive science revolution, it is no longer the teacher that's in charge of the learning. So the student has become the active participant. Learning through cognitive science, the brain of the student matters. What they know coming into it makes a significant difference. It's all about schemata. Okay, that's the fancy word for what the cognitive, you could call it a pattern of thought. You enter a classroom thinking about, let's say you're from Europe and you've never encountered baseball. You come in with some assumption of what baseball is about. That is schema valid. You come in with that. That is your thought for what it's all about. As I then teach you, I'm adding little nuggets to your existing schema. So first nugget fits within your world. I teach you a little thing about baseball. That then becomes useful. I teach you a little bit more, and your concept of baseball begins to change into its own new cloud. It's valid now. But as I teach it, it becomes its own thing. So this outside cloud is not a combination of a bunch of thoughts. It's now one well-formed entity. And that's how you have to think about the approach to cognitive science, okay? Where what we're doing is teaching people by taking into account what it is that they know already, adding them information, and then helping them to reshape their existing patterns. And in order to do that, we have to really know what it is that they are learning, okay? So let's get concrete here and try to make this really practical for you. A really popular way to do this, and this is something we did mention in a previous webinar because it's such a powerful technique, and I'll try to make it again concrete for you. Goal-based scenarios. If you Google around for something called Engines for Education, and if you need the URL, I can send that out to you later. The whole idea is this. If you want to teach somebody, the only thing you have to do at first is give them a goal. Tell them the thing that, give them a goal that they want to learn, and then let them gain the knowledge. Then give them a goal where in order to achieve that goal, they have to learn what you want them to learn. Trucks, I think we talked about trucks last time. You want children to learn math, let them run a trucking company. You know, give them toy trucks, give them the monopoly money, and let them go out and turn it into a business. And I think we also talked about lemonade stands. Both ways work real well. That's a great example for how you might learn math. Does that make sense? Let's talk now about how to do that, because often when doing seminars on this, I'm asked, well, how do we make this practical? The first thing, the way you come up with your goal-based scenario, let's just go back here for a moment. The first thing to think about is this last point, is you want to find a way to get people to learn so that they're pleasing themselves, not pleasing the teacher. You want them not to learn. By the way, the worst motivator out there is the grade. It's not the grade that you want to motivate them by. You want to motivate it because they care about what they're learning. So your job is to come up with a great question. That is it. Start by coming up with a great question. If you come up with a great question for the kids, 90% of your work is done. Come up with a great question and provide the resources that they need to learn and get out of their way. And then you are off and you are in terrific shape there. Okay? That's how easy this is, right? You don't need to be the expert in the room because the resources can provide that expertise. You need to think through a great question, provide them the resources, and then, of course, some rules, and then let them respond and react and learn in the way that they learn best. By the way, I'm not saying that this model for learning works well in a standards-based, no child left behind educational system. We're going to ignore that for the moment. If you have questions about that, let me know later. I am saying that this is an approach to learning. Now, many of you are saying to me, maybe, how do we come up with a question? That's the first question you may want to ask, is where does that big question come from? Gosh, folks, in the day of the internet, this is really easy. You know how I found this is I spent about, in getting ready for this webinar, I spent no more than 5 minutes Googling around. I went science, big questions, and came up with a list. And you can sort of imagine from here, if you're trying to teach science, you can go through these and begin to sort of assume or certain scenarios that you can work with here. If anyone has a favorite one here, pick one, type it out. And otherwise, okay. So here's a request. Let's talk about what's at the Earth's core. Okay, that is an interesting question, I think, and certainly if you're teaching science, I bet it would be really interesting for you. The way I would approach this is, let's say I was teaching, and I'm just making this up right now, I'm not an expert on geology, but let's say I was teaching geology. I might want to pose to the kids, let them try to figure out what it is that's at the Earth's core. How might I do that? Well, first thing I would want to do is, of course, learn a little bit about myself, come up with a few models for doing that. Then maybe I could look at different models and approaches that would enable kids to test these things out. Maybe one approach I could use would be to create a series of models, maybe with something hard in the middle or something soft in the middle, or and let kids experiment. Of course, in this case, we have to recognize for the kids that, let's say I give you something that's all solid and all hard, and you drop it and it breaks. A lot more fragile. It can't recreate itself, right? So there's any number of interesting resources that I can provide you and drop on your desk and get you to begin to play with that would teach you about ways to begin to think about what's at the Earth's core. And ultimately, what I would want to do is give you a series of materials, let you form those, and see if through that you could come up with some hypothesis for what was, in fact, at the Earth's core. Now, notice something here. At no point have I actually told you. What I'd like to do, to the best of my ability, is withhold that answer. I want to see if I can get you to the point where you can figure it out on your own. And then at the end, I can come in and show you what that right answer is. Does that make sense? If you have any questions on that, let me know. But again, follow the process through. And let's go back to also what we learned in the behavioristic model. Here's how I would approach it. Let's say I wanted to teach a subject, could be baseball, could be anything, through this manner. Regardless of what I'm teaching, I'm going to start with a task analysis. The task analysis has to be done. If I'm teaching geography of the Earth's core, I'm starting with a task analysis. Then, if I am now going to, those in the world of cognitive science are called target skills. Those are the skills I want to make sure that the learner is going to acquire. Once I have that, I now need the goal for the student. unlike the previous scenario where all I'm doing is telling the students my goal and objective, I need the goal and objective to be one that absolutely positively pleases them. Okay? So to do that, geez, use Google, come up with something terrific. Then all you have to do is define the resources. You define the mission requirements, let the kids go at it. Your job is to facilitate the learning, and my gosh, your job is not to provide answers. Your job is to ask questions and to redirect and to encourage students to use the resources they have at their disposal. Okay? I'm going to come back to this in a moment because I want to just look at this. I was going to use this more as a summary, but let's just take a quick look at this. Because this is going to give us a quick summary of the two models that we have for education that we have used. I'm going to go to a third one in a moment, but these are useful because these represent two ends of the extreme. Traditional learning, that's the behaviorist approach. The teacher is in control. It is structured. It is organized. You're at desks. You're in neat rows. You're paying attention to what the teacher has to say. The goal is well motivated from the teacher's perspective. Okay. Another reason this is so popular, and this is the wrong reason to use it, is because it works well with large groups. That is often done for poor reasons. And again, if you have questions about that, you can let me know. But it is very easy to manage. And because it's easy to manage, that means that it's often used and preferred, unfortunately, by instructors, maybe even instructors who are a little bit less confident. Teachers in control of the pace. By the way, never have I said during the cognitive science approach that I can tell you we can start at 9 o'clock and finish neat and clean at 9:44. It is much more chaotic. And the main focus here is the classroom. And the cognitive approach, man, we want to get outside of the classroom. We want to explore. Can this work in a school environment? Absolutely. It's a little bit more difficult. But by gosh, if you're home or in a traditional approach, this is absolutely something that can work. Let me just pause because somebody sent me a note. I'm assuming, so this is from Nellie, the question is, then the teacher's approach would be somewhat eclectic. And I'm assuming that that's a question, Nellie, related to the approach that an instructor would take in a goal-based scenario classroom. The answer to that is absolutely yes. But let's make you feel a little bit better. So does that mean, since it's eclectic, that you have to know a lot of things about a lot of things? The answer to that is no. In the goal-based classroom, it is very reasonable for the teacher to say, oh my gosh, guys, you've asked me a question, I'm stumped, I do not know, but fortunately I know how to figure that out. Stick with me, I'll show you how I'll figure it out, and then you see if you can do the same on your own. So it is kind of nice if the teacher knows a little bit about things so that you at least know where to look. So let's say you're teaching about geology, and in order to teach geology, you want to understand something about cell structure. I'm just making this up because there's a relationship between what keeps the cell strong because it's circular and liquid filled, and maybe that helps with shock absorption. You know, maybe the teacher doesn't know that, but it's kind of helpful if you do. But ultimately, what you need to do is just be really good at knowing how to learn. That's the key to the cognitive science approach, because you're not the expert, you're the facilitator. You need to know how to learn. And I see there's now another question, which, oh, I see. So you're asking about mixing the task analysis and the cognitive learning approach. Okay, I confused you there. So take task analysis. My own opinion is that task analysis is something that should be done for both. The major difference is when I do task analysis in the behaviorist approach, I'm going to get a lot more detailed. I'm going to break learning down to much smaller nuggets. Doing task analysis in the goal-based scenario or cognitive classroom, I am not going to get into that small a nugget. So I would say, yes, you want to do task analysis regardless of what you're teaching. That just means make sure that you've taken the time to understand your subject, in all probability by interviewing somebody who is an expert in the field. And you'll use that task analysis whether you're a behaviorist using a behaviorist approach or a cognitive science approach. And by the way, I hope no one is a behaviorist. To me, you want to be a little bit of everything, so you can be an artist where you use a little bit of each of these educational tools at the right time and in the right way. Okay, I hope that answered the questions that are out there. And if there are any other questions on that, just let me know. Okay, so that's just going to be a quick summary for these two pieces. All right, so imagine a line. On the point on the left is the behaviorist, and the point on the right is going to be the cognitive scientists, the goal-based scenarios. By the way, each one of those, we could break those down into many different flavors. Now form a triangle, put a line up top. Let's go back to a different approach. Talk about something that I use all the time in the corporate world. And this is so underutilized. I'm going to give you a really, really useful tool, I think, for completely unappreciated for how to do this effectively. It's called just-in-time learning. What this means is develop tools and aids to assist people in their learning just in time. First of all, in K-12 especially, holy cow, there is never a better time to help a person learn when they're desperate for the information. Most of the models, at least in my experience, that I'm familiar with for just-in-time come out of corporate America. If you imagine a factory. Let's say I'm making bread. If I'm at the point of the line where the dough is about to enter the oven and I've got a problem, I don't have a lot of time to call an instructor and ask for help, or to even call a supervisor and ask him or her for help. So what good, well-run manufacturers want to do is to make sure you have job aids right there, right at your hands, so that you do two things. One is you learn how to learn by using the job aids, and the moment you apply that job aid, you're doing a terrific job of learning. To a certain extent, and this is where they can be a pretty powerful tool, take-home tests can be really good instances of opportunities to use just-in-time learning, or maybe even better put is an assessment in class where you allow kids to use their notes. If what you're doing is encouraging the kids to stay organized and use good tools with those notes, that's pretty good learning. Just-in-time is a very powerful way to learn. This is out of order, but this applies directly to just-in-time as to all the other pieces. So I'll just mention it here is what you're trying to do in either one of these approaches. Make sure that the person has a compelling, personally motivating reason to learn the thing you're trying to teach. If you think about just-in-time, that person is using that just-in-time tool because they have a really compelling reason to do it. It's just-in-time. This sort of draws the distinction, I think, in a kind of hopefully entertaining way about the difference. This is what you have to be careful in putting together job aids in schools. You don't want to, when you allow kids to take their notebooks to school and use them for the test, if it's just-in-case learning, when they say, okay, great, I can take this in, and now I can just, I just have to use it here and I'm allowed to forget everything, well, not so useful. But when it's truly just in time, when you truly need it, it's a much different story. Then it's something you're going to truly learn. Let's talk about a really powerful tool, and then I want to sort of wrap up in about the next 5 minutes so that in case there are some questions that we have time for those. Anyone ever read this book? This is a really good book called The Checklist Manifesto. Atul Gawande is a writer. He's often on CNN. He writes for The New Yorker. So let me ask you this question. Emergency rooms. Study was done to see what makes the difference between successful emergency rooms and less successful emergency rooms. In other words, why do some emergency rooms have a higher death rate, statistically significant than others? You would think offhand there would be any number of answers. I mean, think about that. Why? Why would some emergency rooms have a higher death rate? Think about the reasons. Quality of the physician, level of education, type of staffing, type of technology. Guess what? It is none of that. In a remarkable study, so unbelievable that it's hard to believe. But you can find the article out there. If you Google the book and even the New Yorker, you can download the New Yorker magazine article where he describes it. What they discovered is what makes the difference between a more successful emergency room and a less successful one is the use of a checklist. And this is monstrously significant. Think about that. The only thing that makes a difference, something that makes a significant difference is a checklist. What they discovered in the better emergency rooms, there would be a nurse standing behind a doctor with a checklist in his or her hand. So imagine sanitation before the doctor enters the emergency room. Doctor, did you wash the back of your palms? Doctor, are you scrubbing your fingernails? Doctor, have you touched anything since your hands were clean? Monitoring him or her as he or she is preparing for surgery. That simple act of having a checklist present, and in this case someone to oversee it, is what made the difference between a great emergency room and one which was less successful. And that is, to me, just something that's quite stunning. Now, think about it, though. How many times have you been on an airplane when you've listened to the cockpit as they're about to leave the control tower? Wow, those control towers are terrifically successful, and they depend on checklists. The checklist is an enormously powerful, unbelievably underutilized just-in-time learning aid. So now let's imagine our scenario. Let's go to kids. We maybe didn't do such a good job teaching them how to play baseball. And what we do, though, is we send them out to the fields with a checklist. Well, of course, we want to make sure they're not getting hit in the head with a baseball while they're reviewing their checklist. Before you go to the bat batter, have you done the following? At bat, maybe we make it really big and we hold it across the way. Remember, the strike zone is here. Look for the pitcher to do the following before you swing. When you swing, make sure your hands are back. Whatever it is, it's probably a bad example. But there are plenty of situations when you're trying to teach people something where the checklist would be really useful. Try it with your own kids if you have kids. Math is a great example. If you're having problems with word problems, create as detailed a checklist as possible. This is a checklist of checklists, but this at least gives you a sense, I hope, for how a good checklist might look. It should be no longer than this. Maybe it says word problems, how to do word problems. Step 1 might be, review the problem. Step 2 might break it into small steps. Number 3 would be check your errors. Okay, break it down into this type of list for people. Give them the list. Get them to depend on the just-in-time learning tool. At this point, what you're doing is you're taking your knowledge, you're memorializing it in a way that they will always have it for themselves to use and to depend on for what they're doing. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anybody have any questions? What I'd like to do is see if we can, if you have any questions, fire them away. What I'd love to do is, if you have questions, what I'd love to do is work through a specific example, or get any feedback you might have. Otherwise, if you have, I'm getting a question here. Okay, so here's, okay, yeah, so that's something I can use as an example. So let me just talk about this one real quick. There's a question on music, which, by the way, lends itself really well to these different approaches. And I'll also try to address as part of that how you can help let's challenge learners, whether the learner is, maybe the learner who has ADHD, for example. So let me start with that one, and then I'll go to the question of approaching music. And if you have any questions in the interim, just again type them at me. So a question was asked again. I don't have a favorite approach to learning. We're artists. Hopefully now you have three colors on your palette, and you can begin to mix and match these in different combinations. I don't want to make any statement too general. I'll say for you in general, let's say you are dealing with a child who's ADHD. It is going to be harder for that child to learn through a behavioristic approach. That does not mean it should not be used, because that learner has to be prepared for life when that approach is going to be utilized time and time again. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, let me know. In general, an approach, a more discovery-oriented approach, would probably benefit that learner a little bit more so than the behavioristic approach. But again, I'm pretty big on helping kids work on strengths, but also dealing with their weaknesses. So in teaching an ADHD child through the behavioristic approach, what you got to do is really focus on the size of the stimulus and the frequency of the stimulus and response. For the obvious reason, the kid is chemically enabled, his brain patterns are different, or her brain patterns are different. Break those stimulus into the smallest pieces you possibly can. Okay? Hopefully that answers your question. If it doesn't, just let me know. Okay, world language. How can I teach a beginner's a language in small group? Okay, this is a tough one. The answer to your question is that's a tough one. Let me try to give you a few ways you might be able to do it. Now, I'm going to assume for the moment that you're in a traditional classroom. All right, the question is, how can you teach something like the language, a beginner's language, in a classroom of 30? First of all, it's really hard, so no doubt about that. Let me give you a possible way, and I'm just making this up. This is actually a field I haven't taught in, so maybe I'm way off base, and if so, let me know. We can try to iterate into something that might work for you. But first of all, what I want to try to do is get you into small groups, because 30 is a difficult group to do something exploratory with. Let's say it's the first day of class, and I speak to you only in a different language. By the way, Berlitz does this, and it's a large part of, I think, how Rosetta Stone approaches the subject is, I want you to be suddenly immersed in the language. Let's say I break you into groups of 6. I'm just making it up. That gives you 5 groups. And ahead of time, I've made it clear to everybody in the room that, actually maybe this I have to provide you in English, but I tell people that I want you to make sure that you know the names of everybody in your group. So I break you into 6 groups. Actually, maybe I can do this in the foreign language. Maybe I can do it in the foreign language. But what I do is I give you a just-in-time learning aid, dictionary, but very specific to some of the things that you might want to know. So I'm making this up. You come into the classroom. There's 5 clusters. Kids sit down in a group in 6. You say hello in the language. You refer people to the chart, and you make it clear to them their job is to learn the name of everyone at their table. The kids then have to use the learning aids in front of them to begin to ask questions. You rotate around the room. Somebody's going to try to speak English. As soon as they try to speak English, you look at them. In your language, you make it clear, no, 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 no. Español, Español, Español. To completely encourage them to stay in the language of choice. When you notice somebody's struggling, you don't have to necessarily speak to them in English. Hand them the resource that they need. Now, what that requires you to do is to anticipate this, to sort of imagine the scenario. Now, you could get even one step more creative. You do it, you welcome them into class, into groups, and you require each group now has to get treated like they're at the border. They're entering the border of your country. You're the immigration official. And again, you're giving them the learning aid, but you're requiring them to speak to you in your language. In order to be able to speak to you in your language, they have to get through the activities that are listed on your document. Does that make sense? That's one quick example that I'm making up about how you might approach teaching a language in that exploratory fashion. The key elements here are, I know you got a class of 30. It's going to be really hard that way. Break them into small groups. If you could get them into groups of 5 or 6, that's probably really good. Then come up with a really interesting scenario that they have to work through. At the beginning of the year, it would be much different than the scenario you could use later in the year. Now, I would also say to you that probably what I want to do here is use a mix of of the scenarios. This is a really good example where if I'm teaching a language, by the way, I like the exploratory learning, but I'd want to use my behaviorism here to get you some basic skills. But then I'd really rely on creating scenarios that people can work through. And I see, yes, absolutely. Somebody's typed this. Yes, absolutely. This would be an excellent opportunity to use checklists. Again, it's difficult. It's time-consuming. I know that. Again, it's going to take you 8 hours to come up with 1 hour of instruction. It probably takes you more time. If it takes you 8 hours to do 1 hour of behavioristic instruction, it could take you longer than that to do the exploratory learning. Okay? And I had a question about music. I'll just say it's going to be similar. By the way, one way to teach music is just hand a person an instrument, walk out of the room, let them experiment with it. Maybe even let them get to the point of frustration. In exploratory learning, there is nothing wrong with getting frustrated. Frustration is the point at which people become ready to learn. The point at which they're frustrated, that's the point at which you can really come in. And at that point, that's maybe the perfect time to come in, hit them up with a behavioristic approach. Okay? So right at the point at which they get frustrated, that's where you can come in and follow up with a really good approach. So imagine this, exploratory approach for music. Here's a guitar. I want you to play the following song for me. You got 15 minutes to figure it out, walk out of the room. By the time you walk back, say, hey, what'd you learn? Well, look at what they've learned. Now they're probably getting a little frustrated. Now is a time, and you want them to get too frustrated. You got to find the right line. Then you can break it down, take them through it. Okay, does that make sense? I hope. We're about out of time here, so rather than push it in the final minute of remaining, I'm just going to pause. If you have any final question that you want to shoot out at me, let me know. Let's see. Organize. Yes. Okay, just got a quick question here. Organized learning communities in the class. Oh my gosh. If that's a question, the answer is absolutely. I'm an enormous fan of learning communities. In fact, I don't know if you know Jeffrey Renata-Kane. They have a webinar with us, and probably one coming up on the importance and the use of learning communities include for both helping learning and, by the way, for reducing stress. Developing learning communities in class, you know, if I could make the schoolroom of the future for me and for my kids, learning communities would be right at the core of it, where the learning was coming from the groups of the kids helping themselves under the watchful eye of a good teacher facilitator. So every student's ability is in service of everyone in the group. The answer to that is absolutely. So that your job as the teacher becomes to help make sure that environment is a productive environment, and to make sure the students, you know, you're defining the rules by which that learning community is going to operate. So the answer to that is yes, absolutely. That's absolutely how I'd like to. That's a terrific way to approach it. Okay. Any other questions in our final minute here? I'll just, while I wait to see, I'll just let you know I really appreciate your coming out here. I really appreciate you taking the time. We're just getting started with these webinars. We'd like to keep doing them. In order to keep doing them, I guess we'd kind of like to know if they're useful to you. You're welcome to send feedback to us. You obviously have our contact information from sign up on the webinar. You know, certainly, by all means, feel free to just respond to that and let us know whatever questions you might have. And I think that is it. I want to thank you for taking the time to come, and hope you'll join us again at a future webinar. Take care now.